Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Tonight, we are here for our virtual event in conversation with Dr. Linda Papadopoulos, hosted by the Cyprus Medical Society of the UK and under the auspices of the National Federation of Cypriots in the UK. I'm Christos, the Federation's president, and tonight I'm delighted to be joined by His Excellency, the High Commissioner for Cyprus, Mr. Andreas Kakouris, Efi Mandrali and Efthymia Theodorou from the Cyprus Medical Society in the UK, and of course, our guest speaker, it's an honor to be introducing her, Dr. Linda Papadopoulos, a prominent member of our community and someone who is world famous in her professional field. Her 17-year career as a research scientist and practicing psychologist has led to her work being published in some of the most well-regarded academic journals and has given her a significant media profile. Her observations regarding the psychology behind news and current events are syndicated by the press and media, both here in the UK and also in the USA. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Linda.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Tonight, we would like to talk about three different areas with you that both Efi and Efthymia and I will cover off. Firstly, getting through lockdown. Secondly, talking about some of your work on sexualization of young people and bodily disorders. And thirdly, talking a bit about you, your podcasts, and your media work, if that's okay.
Brilliant.
So, kicking off with getting through lockdown. Working from home, at least in prolonged and extended periods, will hopefully be coming to an end shortly. But it looks like in some way, shape or form, working from home, engaging with people remotely is going to be here to stay as part of our new normal. So what's your advice to people about how to balance work and home as they do work remotely? And how do we draw some of those firm lines and boundaries between the two?
Firstly, thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here speaking to you all. Secondly, I think that is going to be such a pertinent question. I think in many ways, and we were all talking about this before we went live, our technological advancements often outpace our social advancements. So technological evolution is much quicker than social evolution. As a consequence, we find ourselves playing catch up. And during lockdown, we've seen this kind of almost a push or something that should have taken years. For example, online learning for students, online, working, there's people, certainly in my profession, in the medical profession, in the law profession, everything's gone online. And whereas you can work online, I think some of the pitfalls are precisely as you point out, finding balance, finding boundaries. Now, as part of my work, thankfully, I think especially over the last couple of months, actually, a lot of big organizations are asking this question as well, because what they realize is that you have a situation where people are very high on conscientiousness. And what does that mean? That means I want to do my job well. They aren't switching off. So they're getting an email at 10 at night and they're available to answer that email at 10 at night. They want to finish everything they've done because they want to make sure that, that they're doing their work even though they are at home. So they're actually working longer hours. And in many ways, that kind of work is bleeding into their time with their family, into their personal time. And so it's critical. It's absolutely critical that I think as employers, as employees, and I think to some extent, I think there's going to have to be some thought about this with the government. How much work is enough? How do you set up these boundaries? Now, for those of you that are in management corporations, there's some really basic things that you can do, right? I think, one of the most simplest things I often say is when you send an email out, have a message on the bottom that says, it suits me to send this out now. You don't have to answer unless it's working hours. Because if you're sending it out to a subordinate, that feels like they've got to be on it right away. Secondly, flexibility is great, but flexibility doesn't mean that you will, get more done or you have to prove that you're always there, right? So this idea that you're giving flexibility needs to be a two-way street. So I would sit down and I would discuss, depending on the person's home surroundings. So if you're a parent with 3 kids at home that has to kind of I don't know, as a CFO of a company, but also trying to do online learning. What does that mean in terms of meetings? How do you structure those so they're able to be done? Also, what is the route to speaking, and who do you speak to in order to kind of raise issues around boundaries and whatnot? And I think finally, but really importantly, what's really missing is kind of that social glue. Sort of, I think we all remember. I remember what my first job, both at the hospital and at the university, and a great part of that were those mentors that you had, right? It wasn't the formal learning. It was the kind of, the stuff that you'd learn in the staff room, or the stuff that you'd learn in the corridor. And then you'd make your social relationships. And then those would lead on to wonderful things later on. We cannot minimize that, right? A big part of work life is having that social element as well. So again, I think that's certainly something that we're going to have to address.
And is there any way, I mean, it looks like some social contact is going to be restricted, or at least not return to normal for the best part of the rest of the year, if we're looking at it. What can we do, firms do in that context to try and begin to restore elements of that, if anything at all?
I think open communication is key. I think human beings respond very well to acknowledgement and affirmation, especially people in their work, in the workforce. So I think what you need to do is acknowledge your workforce where they're doing well, right? So this idea of, I would say, even sending a weekly email saying, wow, I noticed, this was great, or, calling out people that have done really good work. We need to kind of, again, make people feel like they're being seen, like they're valued. And I think therein lies the problem, that, we aren't computers. It's in some ways the work's being done, but actually a big part of our own psyche depends on job satisfaction, right? This whole idea of who I am, when you talk about identity, who are you? Most people rate their job at least at the top 2 or 3 things, many times the top thing. Well, if that kind of identity isn't bound up in also some idea of purpose and satisfaction, and I'm just kind of producing and not being seen, not being acknowledged, that's a problem. So they need to be on that. I think the other thing that's really critical is you need to be boundaried. You can't, my neighbor was speaking the other day, and he works for a US firm, and he was like, Linda, they called me at 2 a.m, expecting me to pick up because, hey, you're working from home. That's not okay. That's clearly, transgressing really basic boundaries, right? So maybe it was a one-off, but, again, people feel very insecure. So many have lost their jobs. So how do you pick up that phone at 2 a.m. and kind of say, I can't help? You pretend you're awake, you pretend that it's fine, and you work. We need a sense of entitlement, right? And bosses need to understand, or corporations, that they're not going to get the most out of who they're working with if they're in fear of losing their work, or if they're not acknowledging when good work is done.
Just touching on that point of psyche, we've been in some form of a lockdown, remote working for the best part of maybe a year and a half, 2 years by the time this is all over. What do you think the longer term psychological implications of this pandemic will be? And is there anything we can be doing to mitigate them from now?
I think they're going to be big. Look, we have a bit of data, right, on what happens in pandemics generally in terms of who they affect. We know, for example, young people and women tend to be predominantly affected. So we can look at this developmentally. So we know for those of us that have, those people have very young children, most of the parents that I speak to, they're saying, there's no way my child learned as much at home as they would have at school. They feel like they've been left behind. So you're going to have educational sort of deficits, social deficits there, right? Then you kind of go into, I've got a teenage daughter. She said to me the other day, what's the point of being a teenager? She's like, I'm not doing anything. So they're missing out on that, again, that last year of school or whatever it is where they're going out. So that's kind of, we know that that's sort of a big problem. The age group that we're really seeing an issue with, and there was an Ipsos report out recently, what we call emerging adulthood, so sort of 18 to 25. Now, this is a really interesting age because this is the time when you launch, right? You kind of leave home and you create your identity without sort of those connections. So many kids have now had to come back home, right? They've lost the jobs, they've lost the social contacts, they're dependent on their parents again. So in terms of sort of mental health, we're seeing some of the biggest issues there. Then we move on to married couples. We know very sadly that domestic violence is on the rise. What is domestic violence affected by? Well, financial issues absolutely affect them, but also proximity to an abuser. When you're locked in a house with someone who has these tendencies, we're having horrific issues there. Then we move on older to people who are elderly, right? So are elderly who, have literally been isolated from the people they love. We know that even way before the pandemic, we knew loneliness, especially in the UK. I think in the Cyprus community, we're still very family orientated. However, not being, a lot of us still haven't been able to see our parents, right? And a lot of our families aren't necessarily tech savvy, right? So this idea of seeing them stop, and we know that there's a huge issue. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, yes, it has affected people. It has affected them across the generations. And in terms of what we do to kind of mitigate that, I think this is where technology is great. My mother was teaching me how to cook dolmades on FaceTime. Yes, they didn't work out great, but at least we were trying. So she's in Cyprus shouting about my bad cooking over here. So it was fine. It was all good. It's just like being at home. But we do a lot of that. Or, we make a point of sometimes when we're, even sitting there having a coffee, she'll have the same thing I'm having, or my dad will kind of speak about whatever. We make a point of connecting, and I think this has been vital. So I think that's where we use the technology and use it effectively. And then beyond that, just to kind of, again, psychologically speaking, the biggest problem I think with all this we know is uncertainty. Human beings are not good at dealing with uncertainty. In many ways, that's why we see so many anxiety disorders, right? Because it's this idea that I need to control things all the time. With, this really was COVID, the holy trinity of anxiety, right? It was novel. No one knew what it was. It was a genuine threat, and it, amplified uncertainty. So in the case of how we cope, focus on the things that you know for sure. I may not be sure when this is going to end, but I am sure if I pick up the phone, if I FaceTime, I'll speak, I can speak to someone I love. I may not be sure if I'm going to keep my job, but I am sure I can send out 10, 20 CVs today. I can speak to a headhunter. So focusing on the stuff that we can control, we know goes a long way to mitigating some of this.
Thank you, Dr. Linda. I will hand over to Efthymia to ask a few questions about mental health and well-being amongst our frontline workers.
Good evening, Dr. Linda. During this last year, you have focused a lot of your work on helping people with their mental health during the pandemic. If you were to give one piece of advice to the healthcare professionals who are working tirelessly during these times, the fragile heroes as they have been called, what would that be?
I think that's a brilliant question. I think absolutely it would be that you have to take care of yourself too. There needs to be a sense of entitlement over your own well-being when you are a carer. I give your life is, in many ways sort of punctuated by how much you can give. You are not none of us have a never-ending amount of, whether it's energy, or ability to compassion may be never ending, but at some point something has to give. So I think being able to pace yourself, being able to ask for help, and that means taking care of your own mental health. So I don't know if you have this as medics, you must tell me. So as psychologists, one of the great things that we have is we have supervisors, and kind of supervisors is kind of a blanket term where you kind of speak about issues, but actually it's just someone to go to and say, maybe I'm feeling burnt out. How do you feel? And just having someone kind of go, I know, and I do this, it makes a big difference. So again, whether it's a mentor, a colleague, make those connections and ensure that you are taking care of yourself. And I guess the other thing that I would say, and I feel almost, that this is so basic, but it's so key, the fundamentals. Eat, sleep, move. We know a lot of mental health is related to things like sleep deprivation. We know a lot of mental health. We're learning so much more about what you consume. So much of your thinking chemicals are actually in your stomach. We know a lot more about that. How are you eating? What are you eating? And we know that if we want a boost of those feel-good hormones, maybe not the serotonin and the dopamine, but the endorphins are great for exercise. So move. So again, I would say to all my friends that are medics that I think are genuine heroes, been on the front line, but so many times to the detriment of their health and well-being. And if you can't do anything else, talk, eat, sleep, move.
we too have these supervisors or mentors. And I think you're really right in saying that we should be blowing off some steam. A recent study found that around a third of hospital healthcare workers reported clinically significant symptoms of anxiety and depression, while almost a quarter reported clinically significant symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. In what ways can we avoid PTSD symptoms?
So this is really interesting. I was recently on a panel. His name escapes me. This amazing, he was a Harvard professor. Apparently his class at Harvard is the most commonly attended because it's about positive psychology, because it's about happiness. And he speaks about the underside of PTSD, which he calls post-traumatic growth. So he says, and we know a lot about post-traumatic trauma now, right? We understand how it works. But he says, and I found this very interesting, that if you're able to kind of take something, learn from it, and apply it in a positive way, then you're able to move forward and you're able to grow. So what does that mean? That means when you have something and it's affected you so significantly that you are getting intrusive thoughts, you are getting flashbacks, all of these things, that you immediately speak to someone about it, right? So this is, not one of those things of I'll deal with it when I have time. The sooner you deal with it, the better. The second thing to do is to kind of, again, how do I assert some sort of control? How do because the fear is, again, what if this happens again, right? Because it's felt so awful. What if it happens again? So how do I structure, whether it's my internal world or whether it's my external world, right? And therein lies sort of the beauty of kind of how you look at this. In psychology, we speak about problem-focused coping and emotion-focused coping. So very simply, say there was some banging now while we were speaking, right? Problem-focused coping would be me kind of going and asking whoever it was to stop banging. And that would work. Emotion-focused coping would be when the person said, no, I'm going to keep on banging, finding a way to kind of just focus on you and what we're saying and ignoring that, kind of my internal world. And we know that when we develop that, we actually become more resilient. And that's what we need to do. So having an entitlement to kind of change our external world, but also looking at what we need to increase in our internal world to become more resilient.
Is this the way to tackle somatization symptoms as well?
So this is interesting. So my PhD was in psychoneuroimmunology and skin. So I'm very interested about the mind-body interface. And I think there's a distinction between somatizing and then genuinely having psychophysiological reactions to psychological impacts. I think, and again, Effie and I were speaking about this with you again before we started, about this idea that people just find it a lot easier to say I have a headache or my stomach hurts rather than my husband's getting on my nerves and I really hate my job, right? That's just a much easier thing to say. So I think there is something, I think that's why, I used to teach a course at the, for medical students years ago at the Royal Free. And one of the things I'd say is kind of listen to what's being said, listen to what's being said around what's being said, right? When did you bring it up? Think about context. And so in terms of picking out somatizing as opposed to genuine, not that somatizing isn't genuine, it's a different kind of pain, right? You need to get to the bottom of it. So look at when it's happening, how it's happening, what alleviates it. And in many ways, and we know this, when people are aware that their mental state affects their physical state, once they see that connection, they're actually very good at rectifying that. But it's about, putting it across gently and positively, because no one wants to be told, your stomach doesn't hurt if it does. And also providing those kind of core skills, again, to deal with the world around it, to deal with the context.
Mm-hmm. Even though the fatality rate has been twice as high for men as for women, arguably the COVID-19 pandemic has affected women more than men, both as frontline workers, since worldwide 70% of the health workforce is made up of women, and at home, as many countries have reported an increase in domestic violence, mostly involving women, after the viral outbreak. Home is unfortunately not always a safe place for everyone. And what would you say to these people?
Yeah, we absolutely do know that. Beyond that, we know that we know that women are disproportionately affected, like you say, because of domestic violence. But even basic things like fertility, we know that there's a lot of unwanted pregnancies. A lot of women don't have access to everything from the morning after pill to good, gynecological care. We know that's an issue. We know that they're more likely to lose their jobs. We know that they're more likely to do the household chores. We know that they're more likely to take on the stresses and anxieties of their children. We know they're much more likely to deal with the home schooling. So it's not surprising that there's a disproportionate kind of problem here. The solution, no doubt, of course, is multifactorial. I think, it comes from, it's not something that's going to be solved overnight. And what one hopes is that when we have data like this, and there's a lot of concrete data around this, that we need to start having conversations around what the role of women is and why they feel they need to be the only ones to kind of sort of absorb all this stuff. So kind of sharing, the distribution of labor within the house is fundamental. Having access to good healthcare is fundamental in the workforce. And again, another talk that I was giving recently is this idea that, a lot of amazing women, who work in the city and in the financial industry as lawyers, once they go on and often have children, what tends to happen is they come back in a part-time basis, so they don't move up, right? So we don't see them in those top roles. We need to have a discussion as a society. We can't just allow 50% of the workforce to kind of not do as well. It doesn't serve any of us. It's not that the men or women, when women do this, it's 50% of the workforce. So how do we make it easier to come back? What does that mean in terms of childcare, in terms of mentoring throughout, in terms of flexible working? And when we're speaking about domestic violence, a lot of the heavy lifting is done with voluntary organizations now, right? And we know that voluntary organizations lack funding, especially after sort of economic crisis, which we had both in 2008 and then in 2013. So how do we then perhaps look at policies, governmental policies to support women through this? So it's a huge question, a brilliant one to ask, but a huge one. But I do think, the upside of having a few huge questions, there's a lot we can do. We just need to decide to kind of start trying a bit harder.
Mm. Do you believe that the exacerbation of domestic violence may not receive the attention needed in the context of the pandemic?
Look, personally, I've been seeing stuff written about it. I think this is my problem. We're really good at describing problems. We're really bad at describing solutions. So I think, sadly, we're all seeing it everywhere. But what do you do? It's like you just said, what do you do? And therein lies the issue. So it's kind of, we're being sensitized, but actually we need some tangible ways of whether, it's someone that you call, or whether it's an organization that kind of allows you a safe place to stay, or whether it's even basic skills of how do you cope when you are under threat. So this is what we need to see more of.
Thank you very much for your answer. Effie, over to you now.
Moving on from the domestic violence conversation that Efthymia has very rightly brought up, Dr. Linda, in early 2009, you were actually asked by the Home Secretary to conduct an independent review on the impact of the sexualization of young girls on violence against women. This report was commissioned by the Home Office Violent Crimes Unit as part of Together We Can End Violence Against Women consultation. So the scope of the review was widened actually to encompass the sexualization of all young people and to look at how a hypersexualization and objectification of girls on the one hand, but also hypermasculinization of boys on the other, actually perpetuated and reinforced each other. Through the course of the review, what became very apparent was that sexualization is actually a multifactorial issue and therefore needs to be approached from a range of perspectives, taking into account not only the emotional and cognitive development of children, but also the influence of family, culture, and society as a whole. Tell us a little bit through this work what the link is between sexualization of young people and violence.
I think a lot of it comes from the conflation between sex and violence and the images that are produced. Now, a lot of this is online in pornography. And just a note here, we know that the average age for a child to see pornography for the first time is 11 because of smartphones, right? So they will come across it a lot younger than parents think. And again, I remember when I was doing this work, you kind of assume you know what kids are kind of stumbling across. And some of this stuff is extremely, like, actually most of it is not only extremely violent, it's very much about subjugating women. It's about almost sort of, has very little to do with intimacy, right? It has, very little to do with anything. So you've got to wonder, so if we're talking about the pornification of culture, I always used to say, getting kids to learn about sex through watching pornography is getting them to learn how to drive by watching The Fast and the Furious. It's not an accurate representation of sex by any stretch. And it validates this idea that a girl's core desire should be to be desired, and then a boy should subjugate a girl. So that's part of it. But then forget that. We kind of look at advertising. There's a lot of advertising that, again, is very sort of objectifying of women. So women's bodies are cut up a lot more than men's. You use bodiless legs to sell tights. We use faceless lips to sell lipstick. And interestingly enough, when you kind of do eye tracking with men and women, you see that boys will kind of look at their whole body and kind of think, oh, I'm looking okay. Girls are like, I like my eyes, I hate my nose, I like my lips, I hate my chin, and so on and so forth, literally cutting up their bodies. So we know that lies an issue. Then we look at gaming. At the time I was doing this, 2009, 2010, I remember, I think it was a version of Grand Theft Auto, if I'm not mistaken. You used to actually get game progression, in effect points, by beating up a female sex worker. Get this right. You're a kid playing a game, and you actually are validated by kind of doing that. So this was, not to mention, again, in, the way women are referred to in videos and rap videos, and actually a lot of it's subliminal. Like my daughter now is 18, but I remember when she was little, I'd watch sort of music videos with her, and I'd be like, oh, look, all the men are wearing clothes and the girls are in bikinis. Do you think they're a little cold? I think maybe they want a sweater. I want a sweater because everyone, so I'd kind of like sensitize it. What's going on there? Oh, and look, all the guys are singing or playing an instrument. The girls are just like rubbing themselves up against cars. That doesn't look like fun. I'd much rather be singing or play. So again, that was a big part of like, what are we showing our kids? And likewise with little boys, right? Don't cry, be hyper-masculine, be emotionally disengaged. We did some really interesting work back then, kind of looking at even how they were being portrayed online. Now, again, this is about 10 years old, so things have shifted, but actually they haven't shifted that much. We now have quote unquote influencers, right? So again, we know that right when girls are becoming their most socially anxious and socially aware, what do? We hand them over a phone and kind of go, okay, get on Instagram, get on social media and start posting pictures of yourself. If I wanted to devise a cognitive exercise in low self-esteem, I'd get girls to take a bunch of pictures of themselves, edit those pictures so they don't really look like themselves anymore, post them, and then wait for likes. And if they don't get however many likes, take it off and start again. I can guarantee you can make anyone's psyche fall like that. And then likewise with boys, this idea of, how much they're allowed to show emotion or not. So we kind of, I think we're having better conversations now than we were 10 years ago when did this report. We've done some work since that shows that, but I certainly think there's still some way to go.
So in your introduction to this report, following on from that, you write, I want my little girl, and indeed all girls and boys, to grow up confident about who they are and about finding and expressing their individuality and sexuality, but not through imposed gender stereotypes or in a way that objectifies the body or commodifies their burgeoning sexuality. When you were writing this, how did it make you feel, first as a woman, but also as a mother, going through all this evidence and reports on child abuse, reports from people who worked with abusers and domestic violence to produce this vital piece of work?
Look, I guess even though I was kind of aware, kind of seeing a lot of this stuff firsthand, it was shocking. And I think you can't but, think about your own world and, what if, and I think that's why I was so passionate about doing it and doing it as well as I could. Because for me, this was a chance to make a difference. And we did make a difference. We were able to kind of set up, websites where people could report these things. We were able to kind of get age restrictions on gaming. I went to the European Union and spoke about this and spoke about, how we can sort of mitigate some of these things. So for me, again, the big thing was, okay, I'm going to define the problem, but I really need to get some solutions here. We really need, because it became, and this is the thing, I think it became like background noise, like, became like wallpaper. So in many ways, unless you sort of sensitize people to like, look at this image that you're kind of walking by. I remember at the time there was I live down the high street I live on, there used to be an American Apparel. And it was this young girl who looked like definitely a teenager, and she'd have a shirt and it was sort of open. You could almost see her breasts. And I was like, there's mothers with their kids walking by this and we don't see it anymore. So for me, that was the big thing, that we need to have this conversation. We need, this to no longer be background music. We need to speak about it.
Both in this report, as well as in the talk you gave at TEDx Whitehall, Women in 2015, titled Me, My Selfie and I, very smart title, you mentioned the relationship between social media and the creation of online identities, and how this can lead to child abuse and sexual exploitation. In what ways does this come about?
I think to a great extent, the worry is when kids are online, they don't know who they're speaking to. Right. And again, I remember at the time sort of looking at it, the biggest producers of child pornography were children themselves, because they were being asked to take pictures. They thought they were speaking to someone their own age. Sometimes they were, but many times they weren't. And again, I think, there's been a lot of work done. We're much savvier, I think, as parents, with parental control, speaking to our kids in the right way. There's been a big push. I've sat on some advisory panels for sort of, the big search engines and whatnot to kind of think about how we do this. But back, even 5-6 years ago, you saw so much of this, and frankly, you still do. We still see kids, and interestingly enough, especially vulnerable kids who come from vulnerable households, who are much more prone to speaking to someone that they don't know, to being asked for something they feel compelled to give, and therein lies the problem. You've got children who are impulsive by nature, right? Exploring the world, which is again very natural. But if they're not doing it in the safest way possible, the ramifications are very serious.
So, what is our role as parents, teachers, and carers? How do we protect our children and our young patients from this? And in fact, to use your own words, help create safe and supportive environments for our children to understand and explore relationships and sexuality?
And that's a brilliant question. I think it's an ongoing conversation, right? So whether we're talking about being digitally resilient, or whether we're talking about sort of personal boundaries, it's an ongoing conversation. And that's the thing, the way that you're going to speak to a 6-year-old about, whether, it's sexuality or boundaries is very different to the way you're going to speak to a 16-year-old. But I think the first things first is giving them a sense of entitlement over their own boundaries, right? And being able to kind of ensure that whatever problem they have, they can come to you. If I can give anything as a parent, that would be it. I think so many times kids won't open up, and we have research that shows, as I do, I've done some recent research with Internet Matters, and we were looking at kind of one of the biggest fears kids have about sort of saying, I found something on my phone or something's happening, is that you're going to take my phone away. So I don't say it. And because my phone is where my whole life is. So kind of ensuring that you tell your kid, listen, I'm on your side. This is, not something to worry about. You can tell me anything. Also, be sure that you understand the technology that they're on. I think one of my biggest pet peeves was when parents say, oh, they're on something, I don't know what it is. Figure it out. There's a bunch of, websites out there. Go on, see, what is Snapchat? Why are they stuck to this thing called streaks in Snapchat? Why are likes important? Understand why they're important, right? Speak to them, get them to think critically. And I think that's the other thing, having critical conversations with our children. Just like I was saying, what I would do with Jessie, right? It's like, why, this person's trying to sell me this product, why? Do I believe them? What are the questions that I need to ask? Why is this person asking about my personal information? Do I need to give it? The other thing that really needs to be said with kids as well once something is posted online, it's there forever. So my big thing, again, would be like, if you're not happy to wear it on a t-shirt, don't put it online because it'll be there forever. You have this digital footprint that follows you around. So having those conversations, having them consistently with your kids, and again, the same way we spoke about before, adapting them as they get older. So you have to think of the online world, use the metaphor of a bike. You don't put your kid on a two-wheeler, you put them on a tricycle, then they have the training wheels, then you hold on, then you let go. It's the same thing. When you give them their phone at 11 or 12, you make sure all the parental controls are on. You make sure they don't go to bed with it. You make sure it's not at the dinner table. You make sure you have access to what's going on. And then slowly that kind of responsibility is earned. So by the time they're 16, 17, 18, then they're more digitally resilient. They can be on it on their own.
That's great. I'm going to let Efthymia actually talk a little bit more about your work on body image and the work that you did in your PhD. So Efthymia, over to you.
Thank you. So a recent study has found that anxiety and stress directly linked to COVID-19 could be causing a number of body image issues amongst men and women. And we know that negative body image is one of the main causes of eating disorders, such as anorexia and bulimia. And this new study adds to recent research indicating that fears around COVID-19 and the consequences of the restrictions introduced to help tackle it could be contributing to a number of serious mental health issues. These results basically suggest that the pandemic could also be leading to a rise in body image issues, potentially triggering eating disorders. In what ways can we prevent this from happening?
It's interesting. I was reading some data on sort of concerns of young people online, and one of them was that they're constantly seeing themselves sort of in Zoom classrooms or whatever, right? So there's this sense of, how do I look? And it's not the how do I look when I can go through a filter and sort of change everything. So this, being confronted with what other people see is a problem. We also know that eating behaviors change significantly. So I think with lockdown, people have seen genuine changes and fluctuations, whether it be in weight or with skin conditions. So we know that's an issue as well. And I think thirdly, and this is really critical, what anxiety loves, and we know that eating disorders are kind of similar to OCD, sort of an anxiety disorder, it loves free space. And that's what COVID's given us, a lot of time to worry about things. So in terms of how we speak about this and how we engage, to me, one of the best antidotes with body image for boys and girls is to never put, all your eggs and, all your self-esteem eggs in the beauty basket, right? So, when anyone ever says to your kid, aren't you beautiful or aren't you cute? Tell them how great they are at music or at sports. Make sure they know that, maybe the most important thing someone sees about you is your looks, but I see what a kind person you are, what a smart person. So start that from a young age. Also, be aware that they understand, and this is the big thing, again, online, we've got more time, we're comparative creatures, right? So we go on and we compare. But what are we comparing to? We're comparing ourselves to avatars. When I was growing up, in my day, we'd compare ourselves to the girls in the magazines, and we could comfort ourselves with thinking, okay, they've been photoshopped and edited, and this is a girl that lives far away. Now, our kids can't live up to the images they created themselves. And I think that's so sad. They cannot live up to their own selfies because they've been edited so much. So speak to the young people in your life. Speak to your friends, to, even not just the young people, but what you love about them. Increase that sense of self-esteem so it's not just hung on the thing. And that's what I always say, as much as, being a woman and being in this profession on TV, I love my highlights and my lip gloss, love all the books I've written, love my PhD a hell of a lot more, because that stuff's going to stay, and that's the thing, the rest of it goes, and it goes far too quickly anyway. So focus on the right stuff.
And do you believe that increased screen time does more harm than good? We have seen online trends prompting our friends to take up running. Let's not forget the 5K marathon, or to discover the banana bread chefs inside them. Is increased screen time a double-edged sword, negatively affecting people's body image, but at the same time positively encouraging them to do more?
That's a brilliant question. Here's what I think about screen time. It's not so much how much time you spend, it's how well that time is spent. So again, if your kid wants to be on the online for 2 hours, 3 hours, setting up a GoFundMe page for a charity that they really believe in, or researching a fabulous paper, or writing a really important message to their local MP about something, I would have no issue with my kid on being for hours. If they want to scroll literally for 5 minutes on a pro-anorexia or pro-bulimia site, 5 minutes is way too long. And that's how we have to think about the online world. The online world is the world, is everything. So we need to kind of, obviously with with young kids, we obviously need to have some sort of balance about how much time within reason, but actually think about how that time is being spent rather than how much time is being spent.
I see. And how would you suggest we tackle struggles with regulating eating when we spend most of our time at home?
That's a brilliant one. So I think there's a few things that we can do. I think you need to understand how and why you eat. A lot of times, and actually very sadly, we eat in response to boredom, to anxiety, to habituation, right? So all of these things. So kind of understanding that, to listen to your body. Am I hungry, right? Why am I doing this right now? And to actually have a lack. So there's a few things you can do. Number one, if you know that you're prone to snack and it's unhealthy, limit how many snacks you have in the house, really simply. We know people that do that. In fact, we know that, there's been some really interesting studies done about just kind of moving the bowl of M&Ms from your office to like somewhere far away in the kitchen. People are still less likely to go to the kitchen. So kind of don't have them around you. The second thing that I would say, and again, some fascinating research about how bad we are at knowing that we're being full. One of the most seminal studies in this field was done where they took a bowl of soup, and one was just a normal bowl of soup, and the other was piped in under the table, so they kept filling up without the person noticing. So the people that ate the normal bowl of soup reported being full after finishing. The people that was piped in would eat up to 3 bowls of soup and would continue because they didn't realize it was done. So listen to your body. And I think that's the other thing. We don't feel full until about 20 minutes after we eat. So kind of, eating mindfully, eating slowly. And finally, and I would say this because there's so much evidence coming out now, if you are prone to anxiety and depression, being aware of how you eat. So the worst thing you can do if you're prone to anxiety is wake up in the morning and eat something sweet and stodgy. We know your body, reacts, your biome as well, much better to proteins. Try that in the morning. Having some lovely eggs, so making something like that makes a lot more sense. So yeah, there are several things that we can do. And I kind of think hacking into that is really important.
And do you believe that people are using food as a new coping mechanism when constrained in other coping skills? And if so, how can people refrain from emotional eating?
I absolutely think that. I was speaking to a friend of mine who was a producer the other day, and he said to me, there was a report out, 52% of TV programming now is food related. So it's like MasterChef, Cupcake Wars, like how to eat better. 52, we fetishize food in our society, and it's so unhealthy. Yes, food's nice, but the idea that it's like the only pleasure, the one thing we have to focus on, is what causes eating disorders both ways, both overeating and undereating, right? Because we do this weird thing where, you have all this sort of eat, don't eat messages around you. So kind of de-emotionalizing food is really key. And you can again do that. Those of you that have kids, I think it's never a great idea to kind of say, here's a treat and always give food. Sometimes, a treat is a cookie. Sometimes it's a new book. Sometimes it's some vegetables. Sometimes it's extra hugs at bedtime. Be aware of the language you use around food. Secondly, again, don't eat mindlessly. I know I love these studies. Again, one of my other favorites is when they look at how much popcorn people eat at the movie theater. If you get people to eat with their non-dominant hand, so if you're right-handed and they tell you you have to eat with your left hand, eat about 30% less popcorn. Why? It's not because you're missing your mouth. It's because you have to think about putting it in your mouth. So think, right? Ask yourself, if you feel down, will a greasy sort of fry up make you feel better, or will speaking to a friend make you feel better? will, reading a self-help book, kind of listening to some music. There's a lot of ways to kind of, feed into the biochemistry of our brain. And it's not just through that immediate response of food. So kind of acknowledging why we eat badly, when we eat badly, and having an alternative is a great way forward.
Indeed. And finally, what is the impact of COVID-19 on beauty standards and on body dysmorphic disorder?
I haven't really read much around sort of changes with BDD around it. I think people generally are reporting just more anxiety. And so of course, BDD is an anxiety disorder. So I think if you had a predisposition to worrying about whatever it is, that's going to be amplified. I think therein lies the problem with COVID. It's an amplification of whatever else was going on. If it was violence in the family, that's heightened. If it was depression, that's heightened. If it was low self-esteem or body image, that's what happens generally. It's kind of the diathesis stress model, right? We have a predisposition to something, and then a major stressor comes in like COVID, and we see that amplification.
Thank you very much. Effie, over to you now.
Yes, Dr. Linda, I wanted to talk a little bit about the work you did in your doctoral thesis, where you explored how the perception of the way we look affects our behavior. Of course, I see this a lot in my line of work, but you worked with patients suffering with disorders such as vitiligo and how changing their perception of their illness and how they viewed their own body, you found a massive improvement in the disease. Tell us a little bit about this work.
Yes, this work is really close to my heart, actually. I'm an only child. My cousin in Cyprus, Alexia, is like my sister, and she developed vitiligo. And I just remember, I was a teen at the time, and just kind of seeing the impact that it has, the way that people, would look at it, the way that she felt. And I was compelled to kind of sort of explore this area. So I think the first bit of research I did is, how does the way that, we look affect the way that we feel? And of course, there's an abundance of research out there that, that it has absolutely an impact. We kind of feed off other people's reactions. We kind of internalize some of that negativity. But interestingly, while I was doing that research, I began to find an area in the field of psychoneuroimmunology that looked at how we feel actually affects the progression of certain illnesses, especially skin conditions. And the skin and the psyche are really interesting because they're related in a lot of interesting ways. So they both develop out of the same stuff embryologically. They develop out of the ectoderm, right? And we know that, so in a lot of ways, just kind of from our own experience, like right before the big date, what do you get? You get the pimple, right? Right before the thing. How does that happen? And we can actually sort of, look at how that thing sort of progresses based on our biochemistry. So the more anxious I get, not only the more cortisol rises, but the more my testosterone rises. And what happens when my testosterone rises? My sebum production rises. And what happens when that happens? Well, I get the big pimple before the big injury, the date. And we were able to kind of look at that across various skin conditions. And actually, I put one of my amazing doctoral students, she went into the Royal Free, into the dermatology unit, and waiting times fell significantly in the dermatology unit because she was offering counseling. And what she was doing was providing a protocol for kind of understanding when you would get stressed and what that meant for your skin. So, I think there's something really powerful about understanding that our thoughts are not these intangible things. That our thoughts actually do affect not just our behaviors, but our biochemistry. And therein lies a lot of power if you can kind of harness that as someone who suffers from a skin condition.
That sounds fantastic. That last bit you said about actually seeing a difference sort of in practice, in our clinical practice, is great. And I remember actually reading this book, one of your books called Mirror, Mirror, and you write there that body image has the capacity to affect everything from our confidence and self-esteem to the way we relate to people around us. In this day and age, where in particular during this pandemic, social media has become a big part of our lives, and much of our contact, unfortunately, is through social media. How do you think all of our perceptions of our own body images have been affected?
That's a brilliant question. I think sadly, they have been affected quite negatively. I think no other time in history have we been exposed to so many images of ourselves. I mean, ask, you know, our mothers, our grandmothers to show you a picture, and maybe you'll get a couple of albums out, you know, but you're not going to get literally thousands, right? And I think the fact that we can edit these pictures, again, what does editing mean? Editing means I look at something and I fix it. To fix something, what do you have to do? You've got to figure out what's wrong. So we're almost sensitizing young people to kind of figure out what's wrong. And then, of course, you know, there's a whole industry based on selling you stuff because you don't feel good. So you're like, well, if you have this, then you need this product. If you have that, you need that product. So there's like a whole industry based on that. So I would say sort of, again, I say this to the young people I work with a lot. The simple act, when you look in the mirror, I know this is going to sound very sort of, you know, wishy-washy. It's not meant to, it works, trust me. Focus on 3 things you like. Because we're so socialized into focusing what we don't like and fixing them. Oh, I've got to put my under eye concealer, I need to whatever it is I have to do. Stop. Do you love your eyes? Do you love your shoulders? Do you love your legs? What do you love? And leave that mirror thinking that, and do that every time. And we know that that makes a difference because our brain is plastic, right? You think the way you do because you've always thought the way you do. Why does therapy work? Because we restructure thinking. And at first it feels odd, but once you begin thinking in a different way and seeing your beauty and not being told what it is. And that's the other thing that I would say. So much of what we admire in terms of beauty is socially constructed. You know, the only thing that's evolutionary is facial symmetry. The rest, being dark-skinned, light-skinned, you know, big, small, thin lips, that's all socially constructed. You know, if we can push back on that, and we know women have, you know, there was a model when I was growing up called Cindy Crawford, and she had a mole here, and she was like, stunning. And she used to say when she started out in New York, people were like, I can't book you because of that mole. I remember then girls getting a fake mole because she made it cool. The Kardashians, hands up, I've never watched an episode, but by osmosis, I know these women like everyone does. But when they started out, big bottoms, people were getting fat sucked out of them. Now everyone's putting fat in them. So, you know, they've taught us that you can decide this looks amazing. So decide you look amazing. You're your own flower. If you're a rose, don't try to be a lily. If you're a lily, don't try and be a daffodil. Celebrate your own beauty. And I think if we can give that to boys and girls, right, to celebrate who they are, again, rather than buying into these scripts, then we'll be, you know, around much happier people.
Oh, I totally agree with that. And I'm actually really glad that you're bringing all these things up because we get a lot of young girls coming into our gynecology clinics saying, I think this and that is wrong with me, and it's never ending. And I want to take you a little bit to your podcast that you started back in March 2018, because a lot of these issues you explore, and you so smartly again called it the psychology behind. And you discuss so many issues, such as how to improve your self-esteem, beating anxiety, how to embrace failure. You bring colleagues into this sort of like your series of podcasts, such as Marilyn Glenville, who is a leading nutritionist specializing in women's health, Lori Gottlieb, who talks, again, being an award-winning author and a New York Times bestseller of Maybe You Should Talk to Somebody. So what inspired you to start this amazing work through your podcast?
I don't know. I mean, do you know what I think? I think our humanity, our civilization depends on the conversations we have. I think that's the most powerful tool that we have. You know, whether we're talking to each other, you know, and I always say, you know, no one ever talks to you more than you talk to yourself. So what's going on in our heads, what we're saying to each other, that's what matters. And to me, the podcast was a way of, I think, firstly talking to people, like you say, who I think are awesome, doing amazing work, who I really admire, but also hopefully having those conversations where someone could hear and again, take something and kind of apply it to their lives. So, you know, the premise again is, yes, we're going to talk about this issue, but what are the people who are doing the cutting edge research? What do they know works best? So we can begin to grow and adapt and apply this. Because I think far too many times conversation is stifled, and we've seen that. We've seen that politically over the last couple of years, what's happened, people, you know, feeling they're on one side or another side of the fence. And I think the only way we come together and grow, you know, as a society is through conversation. And that's what the podcast is about.
That's brilliant. I'm going to take you to a slightly different topic of your great work that you've done on movies and TV series. Now, I'm sure this is more fun than work, but, you know, I'm going to get to that. So you actually did a lot of work on two highly successful TV series, one called Inside the Mind of a Serial Killer and the other Autopsy: The Last Hours Of. So what brought about the idea to start these documentaries?
Well, they weren't my idea. So I guess I get approached by a lot of production companies, and some ideas seem really interesting to me. I can do them. Some I don't feel I'm the best person for them. But I think, you know, both of these, Autopsy, God, we're on our 7th or 8th season now, and it's just been fascinating. So I work with a medical examiner out in the States. So he does the physical autopsy, and I do the psychological autopsy, and it's usually a famous person. So it's basically really it's about telling the story of the person that's died, but through their final hours. And it's fascinating to kind of, get some of these reports and look through them and trying to kind of piece together what decisions led up to the end or what was amazing about their life. Inside the Mind of a Serial Killer was fascinating, but insane. I remember I've never been colder than we did the one scene up in the moors. There's been some horrible murders up there. I remember filming up there, and I think it was just like the whole essence of it. I'm usually not kind of fazed by too much, but it was a really heavy one. But again, fascinating to do. But yeah, it's a lovely part of the work that I do, and it's been wonderful to do sort of the TV work all these years, and work again in the States. We've done some fun stuff with it. Sort of again eating and body image on some shows, and you meet some fascinating people, and then you do stuff over here with again sort of areas and other specialists that you wouldn't normally speak to. I think that's the beauty of these productions, that you kind of again hear stories and meet people that you wouldn't in your day-to-day job.
So you talk a little bit about the challenges of sort of starring in this kind of documentary, but do you think it changed the way that you viewed and managed patients who then came to see you and you identified maybe similar disorders?
No, I guess what we do on TV is much more superficial. So probably the other way around. It was sort of what I knew from the work that I'd done and the research and the clinical work that would help that. But yeah, definitely the other way around.
Good. So finally, I want to talk about you as a person. What makes you jump out of bed in the morning?
Do you know what, Effie? A few things. I've got one child who I adore. I've got a lovely husband and family, so they're a big part of me. I kind of and as are my friends. I'm an only child, so I invest a lot in friendship. My friends are like my family, so I make a point of connecting with the people I love and seeing them. Also, I love my work. I'm one of those lucky people that I feel so privileged to what I do. When I sit, across from someone and I, it is a privilege to kind of hear about their story and try and make a difference. When I get to sort of travel with my work and speak and meet interesting people doing this today, wherever I am in the world, I love that part to kind of work in policy. That's great. So I love the diversity. And I guess sort of finally, just I love travel. I think that's another thing that I love to do. So when we're out of this, we can actually kind of get back into planes, trains, and automobiles. Yeah, that'll make me jump out of bed too.
That's great to hear. I look forward to that too.
I know, right?
So you work in a mentally charged and emotionally demanding field. Hands down, there's no question about that. But what do you do to maintain your mental health?
I'm really good, I think, at trying to set boundaries. I wasn't when I was younger at all. And I'd work all hours, of the day. But now I try very much to finish at a certain time. And within reason, I keep most weekends free. So I kind of have some time like that. I think that's really fundamental for me. And also, the other thing that I do is I practice what I preach. So when I see kind of that I'm thinking in an all or nothing way, or I'm kind of, I stop. I look at, I think about how I'm thinking. And I really think we should teach that to our kids at school. We can think about the way that we're thinking, because first you think, then you feel, right? So kind of being able to objectively scrutinize that always helps. And I think just laughing, I try and laugh as much as possible. And, like I said, I'm lucky enough, I've got a fabulous family who are really silly sometimes and make me laugh. And that always helps bring me up.
So My final question, I think a very important one. You've had a truly empowering professional journey, and you have worked with women a lot. If there is one message that you want to leave for women, for girls and women actually in today's world, what is that?
I would say be careful how you speak to yourself. Nobody speaks to you the way that you do. Make sure you see your beauty on your terms. Make sure you see your value on your terms. Don't give anyone permission to make you feel less than, because you actually have to give someone permission to do that. And enjoy yourself. We're on this journey, we're all on this journey for such a short time, and it's really easy to pick up what's wrong. But if you kind of try and focus your energy to, focus your vision, your view, your perspective to what's working, it's a great way to kind of see the world, because it's never the problem that's the problem. It's always our perception of the problem. That's the problem.
Thank you so much. I've truly learned a lot in the last hour. But I'll hand over to Christos for some final remarks.
Dr. Linda, thank you very much. I mean, incredibly relatable, practical, and thoughtful suggestions and advice. I'd like to ask the High Commissioner to round up the event today with his thoughts.
Thank you, Christoph. Firstly, Dr. Linda, thank you for what was a fascinating 1 hour plus of listening to your insights. And I have so many questions that I could ask. Let me start off by thanking both Ifeanyi and Efthymia and the Cyprus Medical Society and the National Federation of Cypriots for this program that they've put together and for inviting you today. I had the pleasure of speaking to you at the end of last week, and look forward to many more of those. If I may, there is one question that I would like to ask. If you, as a society and as individuals, with so much going on, if we needed to press the reset button of how we move forward with all the challenges that exist today, what would you say would be the 2-3 most important things that we would need to look at, both as individuals and as society, to maybe recalibrate and focus on what is important as a society and as individuals? That would be my question, but I would just end again by thanking you, thanking the organizers, thanking the participants, who I think all of them will have learned so much from your insights, and personally, thank you.
Thank you all. I mean, it just, again, I do this job because I get to meet brilliant people like you all. I thought, this conversation went well because it was amazing questions. So, Christos, Efthymia, thank you so much. And to your brilliant question, Andreas, it's a hard one, but it's, what would I change? I think I kind of feel that in the last couple of years, political discourse has become really toxic. This idea of you're either in group A or group B means that and again, because of the online world, you can put yourself in these silos and just read the news you want, just speak to the people you want, and actually miss out on a whole bunch of other voices that give you balance. So I think as a society, we need discourse. We need to talk to the people we don't normally talk to. We need to read the stories and the newspapers and the research that we find uncomfortable, because that's the only way that we can put our beliefs and our opinions, because beliefs and opinions are not facts, they're beliefs and opinions. That's the only way we scrutinize them. We don't just need to bolster them, we need to scrutinize them, because I think sometimes, sadly, I think we're talking across purposes, and I think that's dangerous. On a personal level, again, I would advocate balance. I think, like came out today throughout the conversation, what's happened with COVID is it's thrown balance off completely in terms of how much time we spend online, in terms of the work and life kind of becoming conflated, in terms of being able even to balance how we eat and how much we move. It's all kind of been distorted. So I would, again, seek that balance. And I would do it by ensuring we have a routine, the time we wake up, what we eat, how much time we spend at work, but also, again, on a personal level, I really kind of the point of how we speak to ourselves, this all or nothing thinking, this, you know, either everything's great or it's terrible, either I'm perfect or, you know, everything's awful, just kind of challenging some of those thoughts. So I guess in a nutshell, those would be the two things I'd say.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Linda, thank you very much for joining us once again. It's been a real honor. It's been truly interesting and insightful. And thank you to all of those who joined us virtually as well. So thank you and good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.